Welcome to this podcast on the Protocol Windsor Framework, What Next? We're doing this as part of our post-Brexit governance NI project here at Queen's, which has been generously funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. I'm David Finnemore, I'm Professor of European Politics here at Queen's, and I'm joined by a number of colleagues around the table who are now going to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Katie Hayward, Professor of Political Sociology at Queen's.
Hi, I'm Billy Mello-Rouge. I'm a Professor of Law at the Law School at Queen's.
And hi, I'm Lisa Clare-Witten. I'm a Research Fellow at the School of Law and the School of History, Anthropology, Politics and Philosophy here at Queen's.
Okay, good. Well, we're here today to discuss the recent democratic consent vote in the Northern Ireland Assembly, what it means for the future of the Protocol Windsor Framework, and what we can expect to see happening with the Protocol Windsor Framework during 2025 and in the coming years before Stormont is given a further opportunity to vote on the arrangements in 2028. Before coming to the democratic consent vote, which took place on the 10th of December this year, we'll just remind ourselves of a few key developments relating to the Windsor Framework in the last 12 months. We start back with Safeguarding the Union earlier this year when the UK government and the DUP did a deal on the operation of the Windsor Framework, paving the way for the DUP to return to Stormont. We then, at the beginning of February, had the Northern Ireland Assembly returning and the establishment of a new Northern Ireland Executive, and so we get essentially the return of devolved government in Northern Ireland. We then have the Northern Ireland Assembly setting up its own Windsor Framework Democratic Scrutiny Committee and having available to it the Stormont break, a greater role in adopting new EU regulations under the protocol. So that's quite a key development for Northern Ireland. What we also saw was the UK general election in July, when we saw Labour coming to government. Significant, I think, for the Protocol Windsor Framework because the UK government is keen on a closer UK-EU relationship, which could reduce some of the trade frictions we're seeing on the GB&I movement of goods. And we also saw with the Labour government a fairly firm commitment to implementing the Windsor Framework. Significant because that's a precondition as far as the EU is concerned for closer UK relations. But we then had was various new stages in the implementation of the Windsor Framework, particularly in terms of the goods movements between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, more not for EU labelling, and we've also had some further developments around preparations for the new medicines regime coming in January. What we also had was agreement between the UK and the EU to defer new arrangements for parcels until March next year. And then 31st of October, we saw the Secretary of State launch the democratic consent process, which then saw MLAs come together, as I said, on the 10th of December this year to debate a motion in favour of consent. Following 6 hours of debate, 48 MLAs voted in favour, 36 against. Those in favour, as we're probably all aware, were the MLAs from the Alliance, the SDLP, Sinn Féin and People Before Profit. And then opposing were all the designated unionists, so members of the DUP, UUP, TUV and one independent unionist MLA. Okay, so what do we think of that debate? What do we think of the outcome? Katie?
I mean, we have to give ourselves credit right from the get-go in predicting the results to a percentage point. So I very clearly remember the last post-Brexit clinic, we were presenting our polling findings, which have been showing for the last few months about 57% of people wanting the vote to go in favour of keeping Articles 5 to 10. And I remember you had a chart where you looked at where you thought the MLAs were likely to go, and you had it that 57% of them would be likely to vote in favour, and indeed that's exactly what happened. So credit to us, thanks for the research funding, and also credit to the MLAs for so accurately reflecting the views of the population, you might say. And then in terms of the content of the debate, I think overall we'd have to say there weren't really any surprises. It was very much a sort of a pantomime feel, perhaps appropriate coming close to Christmas, with quite a lot of noises from off stage and certain jeers and cheering, etc. Certain notable performances. Particularly commend Jonathan Buckley, of course, for his stamina, and those who sat through the hour and 7 minutes. But really, there was some substantial issues raised, but fundamentally, of course, the main point is that they were discussing something that we are still only at the very beginning of, and I'm sorry to say that because we're all quite tired at this point, but it's this sense of people talking and debating from a position of ideology and principle with respect to the Protocol Windsor Framework and what it means, rather than the full effects of it, which are still yet to be experienced.
Lisa, any particular takeaways from the debate?
I would concur with Katie in what she was saying about this sense of substantive issues being raised by both sides, both those who are advocating a pro-continuation and anti-continuation. But what is quite disappointing to see is just the extent of the continued division and ideological positions and a sort of tendency to rehearse all of the last number of years of division that we've had over these issues. So while there's something positive to say about the fact that substantive issues that need to be addressed are being raised by both sides, all sides, equally the reality is, and the vote reflects, there's still quite a strong divided line. In terms of specific takeaways, I would have to confess there was one point at the debate where Andrew Muir, Alliance representative and DAERA minister at the moment, used Spice Girl lyrics references to make a substantive point about the future and going forward of the UK-EU relationship. And I just really appreciated that, not only because I'm a child of the 90s and couldn't help it, but also that it did actually make a point about the fact that the UK government's ask to the EU around SPS and veterinary agreement is still quite unclear. And to do that through the medium of Spice Girl lyrics, I just have to, tip the hat to him. So I thought that was a good takeaway on a lighter note.
Some of us older ones, I think it was the reference to Pink Floyd and being comfortably numb, which struck. Anyway, Billy, anything you took away from the debate?
Well, I've been accused of being a Brexit nerd and protocol nerd, but my nerdiness is confined to trade law and EU law, so I didn't watch a single minute of the debate. So I have to be very honest. But now that I hear those Spice Girls involved, maybe I should have done. Yeah.
It's probably worth watching the debate rather than necessarily reading it in Hansard, because when you read it in the official report, it does become it's pretty dry at times. But that's it. Okay, we could tell there was a bit of banter around the fringes. I suppose from my perspective, I thought one of the things that took away was how much people were still rerunning Brexit. And a lot of the discussion was around that, and sort of a lot of finger pointing as to who was right, who was wrong around things. And also, I must admit, I was sort of quite struck by the amount of time which was spent on discussing the absence of cross-community consent requirement. There seemed to be a considerable amount of time there. Well, fact of the matter is, what's been agreed has been agreed. But that said, it was also an interesting. A number of MLAs did go into Articles 5 and 10, did try to engage with the issue. And I thought it was also quite interesting that for those who opposed, quite often the justification was there's a review. That one of the reasons why you should oppose is we get a review. Yeah.
One thing that did strike me was Paul Given's contribution, and in which he began by saying about basic expectations of democracy. And this was a point that came through quite frequently from unionists expressing concern about it, i.e. the continued application of EU law with no say that the Assembly has about the nature of that law that applies here. So it was a good point, but obviously Northern Ireland itself is so exceptional, and the idea of being able to, rigorously hold those in power to account and be able to throw out those who are in government, which is a point that Given made, but actually we don't fully have that in Northern Ireland, you might say, given the nature of power sharing here. So in a strange way, it just highlights the fact that the Windsor framework has compounded the unique position of Northern Ireland and makes it that much more of a complex place to govern and to observe.
Yeah, I suppose one other thing was just the range of issues which were being picked up around the frustrations about the inconveniences, the disruption that the arrangements have created and continue to create. Billy?
Is there maybe, so you mentioned the fact that they weren't really discussing the fact that there was no cross-community consent. But is that just a byproduct of the fact that the result was a foregone conclusion, that we knew what the outcome of the vote would be? And so the MLAs just took this as an opportunity to just grandstand and voice concerns that were unrelated to the vote itself, but rather about the protocol of the Windsor framework?
No, I think it was two things there. One is, I think they did realise that they were not going to defeat the motion, and that clearly if there'd been cross-community consent, then the motion would not have progressed. And I think there is a certain amount of frustration there. But I also think that there is a point there about the principle of cross-community consent is in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. But equally, I think we need to stand back and say, well, actually, this is a reserved matter. International trade policy, international agreements, and so in some respects there was I would say, sort of slight inflating of the claim that there should be cross-community consent on this issue. I don't know, Lisa, you've got any comment on this because you've looked at this in more detail than most of us.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about how it speaks to the novelty of the arrangement from a constitutional perspective. And I think one of the challenges in that particular issue or set of issues for how the Windsor Framework Protocol is dealt with by the Northern Ireland institutions is coming from the fact that it is an aspect of an international agreement that the UK government has signed using their royal prerogative powers, which was constitutionally reserved in the UK, but also there's the recognition of the disproportionate impact that it has on Northern Ireland, the unique history we have here, constitutional arrangements that require power sharing. So there's almost like a nod to the importance of cross-community consent by allowing for cross-community consent to elongate the time after the next vote, but it's not accepting that this is a devolved issue, that this is an issue dealt with primarily or principally by the Northern Ireland institutions because they are devolved institutions. They don't manage and mitigate international agreements on a regular basis. So the MLA's discussion is then sort of applying the framework of the 1998 agreement, which is designed to deal with devolved Northern Ireland matters, and so on key issues and controversial issues, there is a cross-community consent requirement normally, but that's been disapplied. But it's not fully removed. There's still an acknowledgement of it, but then it's not fully applicable. So it's trying to walk a novel interim ground, but it then manages to sort of half please everyone and please no one, which is perhaps, that's maybe an inevitability, but there's a logic that you can see from a constitutional perspective in terms of how it's been handled, but it does mean that it can be critiqued from both sides in a sense.
And we see that in the arrangements for democratic consent insofar as if there had been cross-community consent in favour of the motion, then we'd be coming back to MLAs having an opportunity for a vote in 8 years' time.
Exactly.
We actually only got a simple majority, which means that they come back in 4 years' time for the next vote. Okay, so thinking about that next 4-year period, do we think anything will be different next time around, Billy?
Well, there are a number of challenges that are around the corner. Some of them are very immediate, short-term challenges. Other more long-term challenges in terms of the future direction of Northern Ireland's post-Brexit trade regime in the wider context of the EU-UK trade relationship. The immediate ones relate mostly to the implementation of commitments that were made under the Windsor framework. So there are two very important dates here. I think at the end of this year, we have the end of the grace periods for medicines from GB that are being moved into Northern Ireland. The noises we hear from the government is that most of the industry has taken the necessary steps to comply with the Windsor framework commitments, and there shouldn't be any problem. Although there have been noises from some industry representatives that that deadline might come a bit too soon. So that's something to look out for in the next few weeks. The other deadline, which is less problematic, I think, will be the end of the grace period, which was already extended from October to, I think, March 2025, and that's for business-to-business parcels. I don't anticipate there shouldn't be any issue, but both the dates are things to look at in the immediate future. Long term, there are some things that were recognized, identified as problems during the negotiation of the Windsor framework, but the EU and the UK were unable to find a solution, and that's specifically the case of veterinary medicines. So I think the grace period there ends on the 31st of December next year, 2025, if I'm not wrong. And so we'll have to look out in terms of what the EU and UK are negotiating there. And if there is no agreement in terms of how to resolve that, whether they'll extend the grace period or whether we'll have checks on these veterinary medicines that are being brought from GB into Northern Ireland. And then even longer term, it's just about a question of how we manage the protocol in the Windsor framework, right? Because unless something fundamental changes in the context of the EU-UK trading relationship, the likelihood is that we'll have more and more divergence with respect to customs rules, trade rules, regulatory policies. And the more divergence there is, the more potential there is for trade frictions and barriers to trade between GB and Northern Ireland. And how we manage those frictions and that divergence is going to become very important going forward.
Lisa, you spend a lot of time looking at what's happening in terms of regulatory divergence. It's an ongoing issue. A number of MLAs were referencing it in the debate. What do you see as the particular challenges over the next four years in that space?
So I would say in terms of regulatory divergence, it's going to be an ever-present challenge for as long as Northern Ireland has this unique arrangement as the sort of place of intersection between the UK and EU regulatory regimes and legal orders. And so that's raises a couple of issues. In the immediate 4 years, we are just entering into the new European Commission. So they've all just been confirmed, and we can expect a work programme from the Commission for the coming year. Early in the new year, I think February is anticipated, and that's notable for Northern Ireland because that's going to set out the legislative programme from the EU side that they're going to aim to get through in the short and medium and long term. And I think there has been a sense, because we've just been through a year of elections, and then prior to that on the Protocol Windsor framework, everything has been contested and sort of up in the air for quite some time since it came into effect at the end of the transition period. So we're only now in an agreed normal, and like Billy was saying, implementation deadlines are coming up, and this sense of now seeing, having argued over it for a time, how does this actually work and what are the operational impacts? And that's where regulatory divergence can really come to the fore, because there has perhaps been a holding back of introducing significant new legislation that would apply in Northern Ireland and could be controversial. So we're going to see some of that new legislation coming in. And then also on the UK side, the Labour government has been clear about wanting to reset relations with the EU. But as we've already noted, there's a bit of an open question as to what that substantively means. And that's notable because it could mitigate some of the differentiation of Northern Ireland within the UK setting, but it also could not if it doesn't lead to significant new alignment between the two markets. So all of this puts pressure on what is a small administration here in Northern Ireland to have to watch all of those developments and how things are evolving and how they're going to impact Northern Ireland. And we have up until this point really had challenges around transparency and timeliness of information, and we can even see that in the work of the Democratic Scrutiny Committee in the Northern Ireland Assembly, set up under Windsor Framework changes to look at least some aspects of the EU law that's applying and any updates or changes to it. But even there, from some of what's being published about different inquiries they're holding, they're struggling to get information even from the UK government on proposals that the EU have made, whereas they're waiting until the EU have finalised an act, but then that gives a really small window of time in order to really look at the substance. So it is a challenge. There's no escaping that it's a challenge. There are bodies set up, more bodies than we had at the beginning, to try to look at these issues. And that's positive, but it still is a challenge, and there's a risk of gaps. So sorry to be a bit pessimistic on that one.
Okay. Right, I hope you all heard that. It was, we've got a cherry picker outside doing something on the roof of the building here. Anyway, Katie.
There's no cherry picking around here, obviously. No, just to follow up on that. So the question of being informed in response to the challenges facing Northern Ireland, and I'm thinking about the inquiries that the Democratic Scrutiny Committee have been holding and their requests for responses to consultation. And it kind of highlights the challenge that we have, because increasingly stakeholders and economic operators are going to have to be able to be quite adept in knowing the potential implications of things, which they've never really had to do before. And it's particularly complicated because they'll have to think about what it means in relation to their various supply chains, GB, EU, rest of world. So, Billy, you're going to be in demand, I think, in being able to sort of explain, the potential implications of various specific things for this sort of new legislative field that we have. I think trade lawyers will be more in demand than political sociologists, perhaps. But there will be a lot for political sociologists to continue to be interested in, looking ahead.
Just one thing about the debate. Okay, it's clearly a moment because you've got the Assembly now has given its consent to the continued application of these arrangements for 4 years.
Yeah.
It's essentially saying, we accept this. Okay, we know there's voices there that don't. Do you think this will take some of the political heat out of the Protocol Windsor framework in terms of implementation? There's lots of issues coming up, as Lisa said and as Billy said. But should we see this as a moment when people essentially accept or become resigned to these arrangements being there? Or do you think we're going to see that continued contestation that we've been picking up in the polling?
David, you of all people should know this is not going to get boring anytime soon, despite Minister Muir's hope that this would become boring. And I think in the debate we saw there are very strong political, ideological, and that's not necessarily, I don't mean that in a disparaging way, ideological stances that show this is a live issue. So we're seeing it's live as a practical legal issue, an economic one, but also politically. And perhaps you're right. So everybody knew what the result was going to be, but this led to unionists saying this is rigged, which touches on concerns that people have about the insecurity of the position and the sense of powerlessness. So if you have that sense of not being able to control your fortunes, and let's be honest, if you're an MLA, you're elected to represent your constituency, to take active part in the Assembly, etc., and you're not able to make a difference on this, it is frustrating and it does highlight some political difficulties. And then you put it into that broader context of Northern Ireland's relationship with the rest of the UK and changes that are going to be happening there as the UK government itself tries to work out what it wants its relationship with the EU to be. There's a lot of people will be following that very closely, including not just from here, but of course Reform UK. So even as the UK tries to maybe get its relationship with the EU on a more stable footing, it will be constantly being alert to the fact that, well, what was the point of Brexit at all? And what happens in Northern Ireland just sort of is a particularly open sore on that particular question.
Okay. We've focused very much on the way in which this was played out locally. Okay. The UK government, I think, has obviously noted the outcome. Very quiet on this has been the EU. But obviously this matters from an EU perspective because it's their agreement with the UK, and from its perspective, special arrangements have been put in place for Northern Ireland. Just thinking ahead to the next 4 years, do you see anything on the EU side changing? Do you think the EU will take the line that, okay, this is it, you've had your opportunity to vote on this, we're accepting the outcome, yes, the framework is there, yes, we can take cognizance of interest from Northern Ireland when we do the work programme and consult on it? Or do you think we're in for another round of potential pushback from MLAs here about the arrangements and looking for further concessions from the EU in terms of how it's implemented?
I think they've been waiting for what's the phrase, the other shoe to drop? No, is that the phrase? I'm not sure. I will use it confidently and then it will be picked up upon. But they're basically waiting to reach the bottom line where the UK is fully implementing what it said it would implement, and it doesn't have to make any exceptional moves in response to Northern Ireland's exceptional position. But of course, that isn't going to be the case. This is going to evolve just as a peace process. It's continually evolving and requires continual adjustment and compromise. So too, we've got that now for the UK and the EU. The difference is, I think, can they trust that the UK is serious about implementing it? And all the signs so far, I think, have been trying to show, yes, they are. It comes back to that question of competence then and capacity to implement it, and all the challenges that Billy and Lisa have sort of identified, which are just going to become exacerbated over time. So the EU, they would like this to be the end. No more, grace periods, no more extensions, no more weird adaptations and reading the rules through sort of slight squint. But actually, we are going to have to see continual adjustments of sorts. And whether that comes through political pressure, in Northern Ireland, hopefully not, because that's very damaging. As we don't want to see more riots or threats of violence. So hopefully it won't come that way, but hopefully it'll come through serious forward-looking engagement between the UK and the EU, involving stakeholders who do have a sense of the potential implications of the changes.
Just on that, one potentially influential factor there could be the improvement that we're seeing in UK-Irish relations, and particularly just in the wake of the Irish general election and the sense that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael will be back in government with probably a smaller party supporting, and their manifestos this time, both parties, particularly Fine Gael, but both were making positive noises about working with the British government, and even explicitly in Fine Gael's case, being a voice for Northern Ireland in the EU. So I think that we haven't had a very good British-Irish relationship over the last number of years, but we're now sort of heading towards a more positive tone there. So that can be an important contextual factor for the view of the EU of these issues.
Yeah, so from my side, what I think is the issue here is that in terms of reforming the protocol of the Windsor framework, I wonder whether we've gone as far as we can possibly go. Because it's easy to forget that actually the EU has made a number of really important concessions. So many of the concessions made on the Windsor framework, essentially unilateral concessions by the EU, where it agrees to amend its legislation to give preferential treatment to GB goods, for example, which is really a unique setup from the EU's perspective. And it's one that many of us thought wasn't really possible at the outset, when Brexit happened. So these are important concessions. Would the EU go further? I mean, you never say never when it comes to Brexit, but it seems quite unlikely. There's also a question of how much we could achieve by going down that route. I mean, we'd make changes at the margins, but we wouldn't fundamentally change the regime as it exists. So the likelihood is that we'd have to go through some very time-consuming, protracted negotiations, where at the end we get an outcome which is not really satisfactory anyway. In the same way the Windsor framework ended up not being to everyone's liking. So if there are any changes, this is something I called for, is for changes to happen in the context of the EU-UK trade relationship. And here there are, I think, two important things to bear in mind. First of all, the EU is very occupied, distracted by wider geopolitical issues, which might be to the UK's disadvantage because it's looking at other relationships with the US, with China, for example. But on the positive side is that the EU might be very receptive to having a more friendly, more integrated trade relationship with the UK. So there is an opportunity there.
Yeah, and I think we'll see next year what happens as the UK begins to define its position a little bit more vis-a-vis the EU. I think a bit of frustration around that there hasn't been a movement on an SBS agreement, for example.
We're going to have to brush off the dust off our knowledge of fishing and fisheries, I think, aren't we? Because that is definitely going to be back in the...
Yeah, and I think we often tend to sort of view the Windsor Framework Protocol arrangements from a Northern Ireland perspective without realising there's a lot in the UK-EU relationship ongoing. But I think just on a slightly positive note here, the mood has changed, I think. Yes. With the Sunak government coming in initially, then with the Labour government. And it's a small piece, but picking up on the point made earlier about the medicines changes coming in, the Commission did issue a report recently saying, we're satisfied with what the UK's done here. And I think that's probably one of the first reports which has been issued since Brexit, which is actually acknowledging what's been done by the UK government and is demonstrating a degree of satisfaction. But that said, there's challenges coming up. And as Lisa said, a good number of, I think, have been sort of put to one side. None of us have mentioned CBAM at the moment, or yet as to what might be coming down the line there. But anyway, if we turn to the vote or the outcome of it, it was a simple majority. One thing we've not picked up on yet is the fact that the simple majority leads to the Secretary of State convening an independent review. And Secretary of State is due to do that, I think, within now the next 3.5 weeks, identify or announce the chair for that. And then the independent review has 6 months to consult with a wide range of stakeholders, issue a report and any recommendations, I think, before mid-July 2025. Lisa, you've been looking a little bit into what's could potentially be on the agenda there. Do you want to talk us through a little bit?
Yes. So I guess would say, just to set the context a little bit, this commitment to have the review was made initially in 2019 under the protocol as it was and in a UK government unilateral declaration. And at that point in time, the review was going to conclude within 2 years rather than the 6 months that we now have. And the review in terms of scope was to look at the functioning of the protocol. So it's sort of broadly articulated, and on any implications, social, economic or political, on the decision to continue or terminate alignment. But fast forward a couple of years and to the Safeguarding the Union command paper, and there was a series of commitments made in that from the UK government to the Democratic Unionist Party around the review and sort of strengthening it and speeding it up. So as David has outlined, it's going to be about 7 months from the vote that we'll get the report. And also the potential scope of the review now includes the possibility of looking at constitutional issues and the constitutional status of Northern Ireland in view of the Windsor Framework and what it's done, as well as a more focused set of commitments to look at the operation of the single market in the UK and its impact on Northern Ireland in view of the Windsor Framework. And I just think that's interesting to see that evolution, and it's a nerdy point, but even in the 2019 unilateral declaration, the UK government language at that time was to say that the constitutional status of Northern Ireland has not been affected by the Windsor Framework and the withdrawal agreement, and yet we get to 2024 and there's a commitment for any independent review to potentially look at the constitutional status and related issues. So it does speak back to that, what we were discussing in terms of the challenge and the novelty of the Windsor Framework in constitutional terms, in terms of how it has impacted government here and democracy here. In terms of what it actually does, the Secretary of State has been quite clear to say that the chair that will be appointed will get to set the terms of reference. And really it's at that point that we'll know what questions they're going to ask, what the parameters are going to be, and therefore how deep they get into broader issues around constitutional questions. And also, while the vote was on Articles 5 to 10 of the Windsor Framework Protocol, given the language in legislation and commitments made by the UK government, there is a possibility that the review expands to include, in particular, we could talk about Article 2 and the rights issues and how prominent they've been through recent case law, but also Article 11 and wider north-south issues. And there's been some pressure to have that a higher profile from, in particular, the SDLP, but also some of the other pro-Windsor Framework parties, if that's not too strong a term for them. So yeah, I guess it sort of all hinges on what the chair decides, and we'll find that out. I think it'll be the 10th of January that they have to announce. In terms of who that chair will be, I mean, way above my pay grade, but it will have to be someone who has sufficient knowledge of Northern Ireland because of the timeline, which is an unforgiving one, and no time to really get read in. They'll have to hit the ground running.
It's a very, very tight timetable,
100%.
Particularly if the terms of reference are broad.
Indeed.
I'm also tempted to say, well, even if the terms of reference are narrow, I think there's a lot of issues which people want to raise in the spirit of what was said in Safeguarding the Union. But anyway, any takeaways from the debate, Katie, as to what you think people might be raising in that review?
No, I mean, the person who spoke most specifically to it was Steve Aiken, of course, which isn't too surprising given his continued close monitoring of the protocol from early days and his role on the Democratic Scrutiny Committee. So he was talking in particular about Article 7 and VAT and Article 9 in relation to state aid rules, etc. So that was the most specific. More generally, it was notable that DUP was sort of saying that, it's thanks to them that those commitments, it's true for the Safeguarding the Union deal that it included the constitutional dimensions to the potential brief for that review, and the fact that it would be reporting that much more quickly. But actually, yes, I mean, who takes it on, it'll just be a huge task to chair. But the fact that it is 6 months only will give them very good cause to be quite focused. The challenge will be, so there'll be public consultation, right? So people will be able to put in their various points of view. And yes, the question is, how will that be managed? Will they share everything that's submitted publicly? Will that have to be open for everybody to be able to see what people have said? And again, how much will that be informed by specifics, the very nitty-gritty challenges that people have, or will it be informed by points of principle?
During the debate, SDLP, Matthew O'Toole raised the fact that SDLP had just published a paper. I think what seems to be interesting about it is that they're wanting to shift the focus a little bit away from the difficulties, challenges in terms of GBNI movements, to saying, actually, well, does the Windsor Framework deliver what it was originally set out to do? Hence, questions about, does it deliver or maintain the conditions for North-South cooperation? Is it addressing the non-diminution of rights? So there's, I think, potential there for issues to be raised which go beyond what the focus of a lot of the concerns have been in recent years.
And that reflects the fact that no one is ever going to be 100% happy with this, because it is much more complicated and it's a suboptimal arrangement. And yes, we haven't really mentioned North-South, but you're right to raise it, because increasing the amount of evidence being published on the challenges being faced there in relation to, recognition of qualifications, the details around pensions and services, etc. So, yeah.
I had a question. Does anyone know why they opted for such a short timescale, given the scope of the review?
We're all shaking our heads, I think, here. Katie?
I mean, it means that it'll be a lie, it won't be forgotten about, I think, and it'll be something that would be coming in. So I don't know why the specifics of thinking mid-2025, but 6 months seems about substantive enough to do something worth doing, but it's not long enough to have people, ministers constantly saying, well, we'll wait till the review, wait till the end of the review.
But it does feed into the sort of the broader UK-EU relationship. And there's a review of the TCA coming up, because we knew there was going to be a new government coming in. There was moves to sort of address some of the difficulties or challenges within UK-EU trade. I think I was picked up on a comment, I think, which Doug Beattie has since released, saying that actually, if you have the review, if you have the UK-EU relationship evolving, could you get to a point where Articles 5 to 10 become moribund? And that, all these things could come together. Now, you might say this is an optimistic view of the 6 months, but where we are is all these things are coming together during the course of 2025, when the UK is expecting to begin some sort of negotiation with the EU at some point.
Can Billy give Doug Beattie a reality check?
Now?
Well, he can pick it up later.
Yeah.
And just doesn't are we likely ever to get to the point when Articles 5 to 10 will be moribund?
Yeah, if we join the EU. I mean, as I was saying before, anything is possible, right? Anything is possible. And this was the case, on the day after the referendum. It was the case after the protocol was agreed. It was the case after the Windsor Framework agreed. Anything is possible as long as the parties, and by the parties I mean the EU and the UK, and more specifically the UK, have an understanding and an acceptance of the trade-offs involved, right? And if you want to do away with Articles 5 to 10, that's going to require strong disciplines on regulatory alignment, and particularly for the UK to align with EU law, and not just EU law, the way in which it is applied and interpreted by the ECJ. The trade-off is very simple. If you want to remove barriers to trade, you need to pursue further market integration, which means you have to relinquish some regulatory autonomy. So it depends on what you value the most. If you value the removal of those barriers to trade, you will happily or unhappily relinquish some of that regulatory autonomy. If, on the other hand, and this was the assessment that was made back in 2017 and 18, if you value regulatory autonomy more, then you'll sacrifice the trade aspect of that relationship with the EU. So to go back to Mr. Beattie's comment, you could arrive at a situation where Articles 5 to 10 are no longer relevant, but you need to have very extensive, full-scale regulatory alignment across the board, not just on SPS or veterinary medicines, but across the board, across all trading goods.
And it's perhaps worth making the point that if the UK was to pursue that direction, there would have to be at least some revision of trade agreements that they've signed with other countries outside the EU since the end of transition period, because of the commitments made in there that are different than those that would have to be made to apply EU law in particular sectors. So that would include the Australia-UK deal, the New Zealand-UK deal, and more recently the CPTPP, an acronym I always get wrong. So from a UK perspective, and that was of course a big part of the narrative of being able to go out and conclude all of these trade agreements as a result of Brexit freedoms. So there would have to be not just a significant reworking of the UK-EU relationship, but also a reworking of UK relationships with other trading partners.
But you would be talking about full-scale repeal of a number of legal instruments and regimes that have been established post-Brexit. So it's domestic regulation across the board. It's also, as you say, FTAs. It's also about customs, rules. All of that would have to be changed to align with you, which is a big ask. So realistically, is that going to happen in the short to medium term? Unlikely. And really, would you do that unless you're becoming a member of the EU? It seems unlikely, but it is possible. It goes back to the same. It is possible. It's just whether you're willing to take the cost and make the sacrifices that are required to get there.
Talking about what might be possible, the review is actually charged with making recommendations with regard to any new arrangements it believes could command cross-community support. Lisa, do you think there's anything that the review might actually recommend which could command cross-community support, given what we know about the positions on Windsor Framework Protocol?
Well, following from that conversation we were just having, and based on our polling, there's a couple of issues or points where there is support across the board in Northern Ireland, one of which is closer UK-EU alignment, such that the GB NI requirements on checks and goods entering Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK becomes less significant. As we were just discussing, that comes with all of those issues around trade-offs and what the specific form of any additional commitments for the UK to align is, but nonetheless that has 75% support, I believe, from our polling, which includes individuals from Unionist, Nationalist, neither, all of the backgrounds that Northern Ireland holds. In terms of broader cross-community consent, it's difficult to see that there could be a central core ask. There are marginal issues that could bring in, and some of those are significant. It's not to downplay them, but around transparency and a sense of Northern Ireland having the avenues to input into the arrangement that it's subject to. I'm not sure we can bring everybody together in 6 months and reconcile over the Windsor Framework, but as Billy says, never say never. I mean, anything is possible, but...
Any comment on this, Katie?
Yes, also in our polling, we've seen people want to see the UK and EU jointly present factual information. And no doubt a big part of the disruption caused by the Protocol Windsor Framework has been simple confusion about it and misrepresentation of it. In some cases, especially in the early days, about downplaying its significance. And that really would be very significant change, both in terms of the actual act of the two sides being careful to agree exactly what it is that needs to be done, and also just helping people prepare for the changes with respect to the technical issues that Billy's mentioned already.
It might also just be worth noting that we have consistently found when we ask people who they trust to act in Northern Ireland's interests in regard to these matters, Protocol Windsor Framework, business community gets support from the majority, consistently, not a huge majority, but nonetheless over 50% expressing trust in Northern Ireland business representatives. And there is a consensus on how to improve some of the arrangements, and it comes back to, again, that sort of timeliness of information, but also a sort of education campaign in other parts of the UK for traders bringing goods into Northern Ireland and supplying the Northern Ireland market. I think there's a growing sense that some businesses are just opting out of the Northern Ireland market due to the sense of additional complexities, but that could be addressed perhaps with better information and support for GB businesses to continue to supply. And ditto, there's also been suggestions around the potential value of an information campaign and assistance to EU traders to know that the Northern Ireland market is still accessible and worth trading into. So if the review is talking to business, who are, as far as it goes, one of the most trusted sort of sectors in this context, then there could be a couple of clear asks that could garner some support. As I say, it's maybe not going to deal with the core fundamental issues of what the arrangement is, but it could improve things and also mitigate some of the problems we've talked about in terms of regulatory divergence and that sort of thing. So
business people are always surprised whenever, or at least when I talk to them, when I tell them they're the most trusted stakeholders in Northern Ireland. So there's maybe there another research project to be carried out about how Brexit rehabilitated business industry's reputation.
yeah, I think it did.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, it's not a big ask, right, for to have the information in good time. And before we saw that wasn't happening, but partly because perhaps the British government didn't want to be absolutely explicit about the requirements that were to be in place. Now we know they are being explicit, they want to implement the Windsor Framework, and yet we still don't have the information readily available or easily accessible or 100% accurate. And so you're almost setting yourself up to fail constantly until we get to that routine that they know that the information is there, clearly available, and the recent experience in relation to the General Product Safety Regulation changes and all the concerns that were expressed on social media about that, and yet the information wasn't provided until like the week before from the government, and then not adequately. So of course people then, businesses are deciding not to send goods into Northern Ireland.
I suppose the key point in relation to the review is that information sharing is something which is in the gift of the UK government to give. Any recommendations coming out of the review may actually require something which the UK government may not be willing to proceed with, but also if it's going to go down to fundamentals in terms of the Protocol Windsor Framework, it's something which the EU is going to have to agree to as well. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves here that this is a UK internal unilateral review. This is not something which is sanctioned by the provisions on the democratic consent in the Protocol Windsor Framework itself. And do we actually run the risk of this review possibly raising too many issues which possibly there's not the political will to resolve on the UK side, or there's not the political space to do it with the EU?
And we need to take the lessons from safeguarding the union on board. So was it 5 or 7 points? I can't remember now. And the GB had those requests, and they wanted those points to be met. They were never possible to fully achieve without the EU being involved, fundamentally in changing the Windsor Framework again. And yet the Safeguarding the Union deal was sold as having met those concerns, and oversold, as everybody acknowledges now. And therefore, unsurprisingly, we've seen a decline in unionist trust of these arrangements, most dramatically amongst strong unionists, but increasingly amongst softer unionists as well, just this fundamental scepticism. So there's a real concern that needs to be addressed around this independent review that, as you say, it's the government and all concerned, including all parties, are realistic about what this cannot do, because it's not going to send the EU back into renegotiations.
And it's possible also the argument that there might be things coming through here which the UK government might not be necessarily willing to do, because one of the reasons we're not seeing ambition in terms of an SPS agreement at the moment is concerns about regulatory alignment, possible jurisdiction of the Court of as being not politically acceptable within the GB political context, particularly for Labour in terms of the seats it's regained or gained from Tories, which it would see as being in danger from particularly reform come a subsequent general election. Yeah. I don't know, Billy, Lisa, any comments on any views on what you think might come out of this in terms of reaction to recommendations, any possible changes?
Well, I think, like we were just saying, the idea that it'll solve all of the problems is not realistic. I think there is a question around how much it is used either within Northern Ireland politics to sort of reinforce existing divisions, and we have to remember, like, we operate under an executive that requires cross-community consent and continued operation, and this issue splits the executive down the middle, and so there's that sort of open question for how the review is received in Northern Ireland political context, but in particular in the executive and what they do in response to it, or whether or not they do respond. There'll be a debate in the Assembly on the review's conclusions, and then I believe a debate in Westminster as well. And as you say, there's sort of two different contexts in which it'll play out politically, and in the Westminster context it really is about how much Labour are willing to concede, how much it's going to be set up as a Northern Ireland issue rather than an issue that is to feed into the broader conversation around UK-EU relations, and how they bring that forward, and then reform as a voice of protest, really, and how they take this and use this or don't. And I guess it'll depend what the conclusions say, and it's an open question.
Yeah, I mean, I have no insights on this except to say, I'm not saying this is an insight, by the way. My only comment would be that this whole independent review, listening to you guys talking about it, is a microcosm of my experience following Northern Ireland and Brexit and the protocol for the past few years, which is that I go in with the assumption that these issues are highly technical, technocratic exercises. And in the end, there's always a hidden agenda. There's always a political dimension. And all of a sudden now I'm thinking, actually, the outcome of this review could be politicized, right? Because if issues are identified, then one party may decide to flag it up and make it political. And then the issue then is, how do we address this with you, which is the EU's being completely separate from this whole exercise. And how does the EU respond to something which was supposed to be a technical exercise and now has become a political phenomenon? And so that really is the whole lifespan of the protocol in a nutshell, at least from my perspective. I don't know what you think.
I was being falsely modest earlier when I said there'd be loads of work for trade lawyers and not so much for political sociologists, because the key lesson, I think, of all of this, and we've had these debates, David, since the very beginning with our lawyer friends about the importance of law versus politics. And even if I think back to the fundamentals about the hunt for unicorns and resolving the Brexit trilemma, and now I'd be willing to say we've definitely got like a white horse with a long mane and a paper cone on its head and maybe some sprouting feathers nearby, which was absolutely clear we could never have. So yes, you're absolutely right, Billy, to point to the fact there's this capacity really for changing what we thought to be the fundamentals, like the absolutes in these things do seem to be shifting, and not just in terms of the interpretation, but the actual things that are possible to the law itself.
Just one additional point in terms of responding to the review. I think it might also be interesting to see if and to what extent the Scottish Government and Welsh Government pick up any recommendations. We've recently heard from Central UK Government that they're going to review the UK Internal Market and its Act, the 2020 Act that now sets the framework for how goods and services move around the UK generally, and was very controversial from a devolution perspective, and whether or not the Northern Ireland issues and set of issues sort of is linked into that broader conversation around intergovernmental relations in the UK and whether or not they're going to improve under Labour or continue to be contested, and Brexit was really detrimental for them. I think that's a question too in terms of just the different spheres in which this set of trade, legal, political issues plays out.
Interesting year ahead. Around the review. Interesting 4 years ahead until we get to the next democratic consent vote. I think it's fair to say we'll all be following it quite closely and no doubt offering some analysis and comment on developments. But as far as our post-Brexit governance NI project is concerned, that formally concludes at the end of this year. Thanks again to the Economic and Social Research Council for the funding and also to all those who have worked with us and with whom we've engaged while we've been going through the project, whether that be on some of the stakeholder engagement, whether it be in Brexit clinics, whether it be in the polling. I suppose a particular shout out there to Lucid Talk for contributing there. As we come to the end of the project, what do you think we've learned? Katie, you've been in from the word go in terms of even drafting the project. Reflections, takeaways.
Yes, I should be able to have a succinct answer to this, but it all feels, if I'm honest with you, a little bit of a blur. But you're right to do the shout outs to the various people, and I would say one of the best things of this project has been obviously working with you guys, but the stakeholder engagements and of various different types, and including in the post-Brexit clinics, because I think the sort of recognition of it's been a privilege to be involved in something that's quite so of the moment, trying to respond to and explain an emerging, evolving, highly complicated situation. See the public engagement and interest in that. It's been a real challenge, but I think sort of, yes, a renewed and sincere appreciation for the expertise that exists actually in the wider community, from civic as well as business groups.
Okay, Lisa, you've been spending a lot of time looking at legislation and regulatory alignment and divergence and various other data and etc.
I would say I've been surprised at how genuinely interesting I find it all, and I can honestly say, like, regulatory divergence and dynamic regulatory alignment, it's kind of fascinating.
People listening can't see this, but your eyes are lit up right now, Lisa, as you're saying all of that.
But yeah, I think it does speak to what you were just saying, Katie, about that sense of privilege, and it's a unique context to be researching something that is so live. And I think at times it's come with almost like an ethical tension, because on the one hand, it's properly fascinating from a research perspective and it's unfolding in real time, and you're not quite sure, even if you think you know the trajectory it's on, there have been many twists and turns. And on the flip side, there have been times that have felt quite edgy. It could have gone worse than it did. Didn't always go well, but it could have gone into an even more negative place. And so you sort of flip between those two senses of the experiencing it from an intellectual researcher point of view, and then experiencing it from a person who lives in Northern Ireland and who will be impacted by the outworkings of this. But overall, a privilege, and Brexit is the gift that keeps giving in terms of research.
Billy's a trade lawyer.
I've learned a lot in different ways. One way is that, before I was really an EU external trade lawyer. And, I've told you guys this before. When I wrote something, maybe it would get read by 5-10 people, and it would take years for it to get any feedback from anyone, if anyone ever read it. And then all of a sudden you're thrown into Brexit, and it's a very fast-moving environment, it's a very political environment, and you're having to carry out research in a reflexive manner where you have to react to new events all of the time. And that required new skills, which I didn't have before. It required being able to explain very complex ideas in a way that anyone can understand, even non-trade lawyers, which was very difficult. It required being able to package information through narratives so that people can better understand them. I also learned that at one point, you can go too far down that way. And I think at some point during Brexit, maybe us academics, but also think tankers and, commentators got too used to responding too quickly to the latest developments. And when it came to Northern Ireland, there were developments every day. Every day there was a life-changing development. And everyone wanted to be the first one to give their takes and opinions. And one thing I learned fairly early on, thank goodness, was that actually sometimes it's better just to hold back and read the text, if there is a text, because so often people will comment, giving opinions on things that they didn't have. They just had a comment from someone like David Frost, and and that's really nothing to go on. So sometimes just taking a step back and waiting until you have the information so you can make an informed opinion, that still has value, even in a very fast-paced environment of Brexit. The other thing I learned, which is probably more important, is I was thinking the other day that when the referendum happened, I'd been in Northern Ireland for 2 years. Last June, I celebrated 10 years here in Northern Ireland. So my experience of Northern Ireland has been Brexit or Brexit. And one of the positives I can say about that is that it's given me the opportunity to get a fuller understanding and appreciation of Northern Ireland, to really understand this place. And importantly, how history shapes and informs everything here. And it's something I hadn't fully appreciated when I got here. Everything, as we've discussed here today, from the most technical, boring, mundane issues can be politicized and seen through the lens of history. It's something I didn't appreciate before, but I do now. But it's something I still think is not fully appreciated in other parts of the United Kingdom. And so that's an experience that I found very valuable for me in trying to understand Northern Ireland and the people I interact with. I interact on a day-to-day basis. And you guys have been fun too. Yeah.
Well, that's very kind of you to say so. Anyway, I think you probably appreciate that we could probably go on reminiscing about the project for quite some time here, reflecting on the highs and lows and the complexities, the blurredness of a lot of it, all the political developments that we've seen. I think just to conclude, it's been challenging. It's been fascinating. It's been great to be involved with so many people. I think reiterating what's been said earlier, the engagement that we've had at all variety of different levels has been, I think, way beyond what we anticipated at the outset. And from that perspective, it's been a really enjoyable period. But as I said, a lot of the issues which we've been discussing are going to continue to be in the headlines. They're going to continue to run. There's lots of challenges out there, and we will continue, as I said earlier, to follow developments and maybe come back with another podcast at another point where we reflect on what's been happening. But for the moment, thanks very much, everybody, for contributing here today, and thank everybody for listening. And yes, enjoy the Prodigal Windsor framework next year and for the subsequent years to come. Thank you.